Professor, for that very kind introduction, and thank you all for taking time out this evening. I was hoping that people will be too scared because of weather factors to show up, and I'll just have a few people sitting around the table to have a chat. I've just come back from a trip to India, and I thought that I was getting away from Snowzilla, but the Delhi pollution got me, so I still am coughing, and you will have to bear with me during the course of my presentation. Strepsils and its magic notwithstanding. Let me just begin by explaining why I have titled my talk Reimagining Pakistan. It's actually a project that I'm working on, which I hope by the middle of this year will result in a new book titled Reimagining Pakistan. Why does Pakistan even need to reimagine? Those of you who are of Pakistani origin will particularly sympathize with me when I say that Pakistanis get very concerned by the fact that the whole world is concerned about their country. 74% of Americans in opinion polling by Pew say that they have an unfavorable view of Pakistan. This despite the fact that Pakistan during the 1950s and 60s was described by no less a person than President Dwight Eisenhower as America's most allied ally. China, which is the country that Pakistanis are now turning to as the lender and investor of last resort, as well as the great white hope for Pakistan's longer term future. Guess what the situation is there? Well, in polling done there last year, only 30% of Chinese had a positive or favorable view of Pakistan. Now Pakistanis get very annoyed, and possibly rightly so. They see themselves, and the people around them, and they see we are good guys, we are good people. We are a creative society, we create good music, we write good poetry, some of us paint, we are good children and parents to one another, we are good neighbors, our hospitality is remarkable, we are very pleasant to people that we interact with. Again, I will address this message only to those of you who are of Pakistani origin here. Consider yourself very lucky if you are sitting in an American university classroom, because you are in a very, very small minority. If I give you the statistics of what the numbers are of Pakistanis and Pakistani Americans in American universities, you will be surprised to know that there are fewer Pakistani students at American universities than there are students from Nepal and Bangladesh. The reason why I cite those two countries is because Bangladesh is almost the same size as Pakistan, Nepal is much smaller, and yet more Nepalese kids end up in American universities than Pakistani students. And so if as a Pakistani you are worried about why the rest of the world is worried about Pakistan, pause for a moment and start reflecting on why the rest of the world looks at us the way it does. First, Pakistan is not a historic country. Unlike other countries, most countries, expand their borders, contract their borders, but they have a long-standing historic identity. Even a country like Iraq, which is a post-First World War creation, takes its name from a historic identity. Iraq was one of the various names used in history for the region called Mesopotamia. Syria, there has been a Syria in history of some sort or another, different borders perhaps, but an identity that people can relate to in history. In Africa, many of the post-colonial countries have gone into history to find names of some ancient kingdom to give themselves. Pakistan, on the other hand, to borrow a line from Homeland, which is not very popular with Pakistanis, is an acronym. It's a name that never existed for a country in history. It was a contrived name, a name created by a bunch of students at Cambridge University for an idea. The idea being that the Muslims of South Asia, by virtue of their distinct and unique history, deserved to have a country of their own in areas where they constitute a majority. But history has not been very kind to Pakistan even in that term. A majority of South Asian Muslims are no longer in Pakistan. after the separation of Bangladesh. Bangladesh and India together account for more Muslims of South Asia than Pakistan does. So in that sense, the idea of Pakistan, the origins of Pakistan, and the lack of history of Pakistan loom large in the life of Pakistanis, whether they want to confront that reality or not. And then, the only other country that is in a similar position was the country of Yugoslavia, the country of the South Slavs, which was, after the First World War, similarly put together and did not last for even a century. And so there are concerns around the world about Pakistan for that reason. Now, Pakistan has already been dismembered once. The greater half, more populous half, which was East Pakistan, chose to become Bangladesh in 1917. Pakistan is the country with the 8th largest military in the world, possibly the 6th largest nuclear arsenal, and yet it is only the 42nd largest economy in nominal GDP terms and 26th in purchasing power parity basis. 2/3 of its population lives below $2 a day per family. And so, while Pakistanis understand why Pakistan should exist, and Pakistanis know why Pakistan is so important in the world, and while Pakistanis feel that they are the ones who have been injured by a lot of international factors, that's what Pakistanis will tell you. Jihadism, not our fault. It was the Americans and the Saudis. They came and set up operations against the Soviets in the 1980s, and we are still living with the consequences. We've been to war with India 4 times, more than any other single country has done, except the United States, since the Second World War, and the only one to have gone to war with the same neighbor over and over again 4 times. Again, not our fault. It's all because of India. It's all because of Kashmir. We have not been able to raise our literacy rates at the same level as our various neighbors. For example, in 1947, what is today Pakistan had a literacy rate of 16%. What is today India had a literacy rate of 18%. Today, India's literacy rate has gone up to 72%. Pakistan's literacy rate hovers around 52 to 53%, depending on which way you count. So what was a 2% difference has become a much bigger difference. Then the number of PhDs produced by Pakistan since 1947 in all subjects together, from Punjabi literature to microbiology, the number of PhDs in Pakistan since 1947 is less than the average number of PhDs produced in India every year. The reason why, again, I use the Indian comparison is because that is something that is almost ingrained in Pakistani discourse. Turn on a Pakistani television channel, and whether it's in the field of cricket or whether it's in the field of grand civilizational ideas, it is always a constant competition with India. Whereas, if it's competition, my dear Pakistani friends, you have already lost. Because while the population difference between India and Pakistan is 1:6, in virtually every other thing, the ratio is far greater. The size of the economy, it's about 1:14. The number of academic institutions, institutions of higher learning, the number of graduates, college graduates, etc., the gap is much bigger. And there's only one thing in which we are competitive, and I already said it earlier, but probably many of you didn't notice. That one area is the military realm. Pakistan still has the world's 8th largest army, 11th largest military by firepower, 6th largest nuclear arsenal, and probably the largest capacity of any country in the world to be able to produce jihadi militants that operate in neighboring countries. That is the reason why the rest of the world worries about us, about Pakistan. Now, Pakistan's origins, of course, continue to be debated. Put 2 Pakistani children, Pakistani young people, and 4 Indians in a room, put a few beers in between them, and it's only a matter of about an hour, hour and a half before they will be debating whether partition should have taken place or not. I, on the other hand, approach this totally differently. My argument is that if you look at the demographic profile of Pakistan, Pakistan's median age is 22. which means more than half of Pakistan's 190 million people are below the age of 22. That means that half of this population did not see East Pakistan as part of Pakistan. They were born well after 1970. And if you see the overall profile of Pakistan, 88% of Pakistanis right now were born well after partition. I am one of those. So the only nationality I have ever had is Pakistan. While I am quite interested in the historic argument of whether Pakistan should have been created or not, whether Mr. Jinnah, the founder of Pakistan, wanted a secular state or an Islamic state, whether he actually wanted a complete break or he wanted a confederal arrangement, etc., etc. It's only historic. The reality is that the only nationality I was born with and that I still continue to have is Pakistani. So from my point of view, it makes sense to try and reimagine Pakistan. And why do I use the term reimagine? Well, most of you have taken some courses in policy, so you probably are familiar with the argument of Benedict Anderson, who says that national identity or a nationality is essentially a nation, is an imagined community. It's the shared imagination of people. And some people have used that and criticized Pakistan, and this, by the way, the number of people who've done that in history is amazing, staggering. For the purpose of my book, I've researched and I've found that some of the smartest political scientists in recent history were very critical about the very idea of Pakistan. Way back in the 40s, even after Pakistan's creation. In 1956, which is the year, by the way, of my birth, in 1956, Hans G. Morgenthau wrote a piece in the New Republic in which he said, when I look at the world's map, the one country that does not make any sense to me is Pakistan. And at that time, of course, he was talking about East and West Pakistan being two separate entities. And then he made a prediction, which, by the way, with hindsight, sounds very prophetic. He said, under pressure of ethnic disagreement and discord, Pakistan's leaders will turn more and more to religion to consolidate national identity, which in turn will make Pakistan less and less pragmatic and practical as a nation, and more religious, and therefore prone to violence. Quite interesting. He said that in 1956. Now, using the Anderson formula of a nation being an imagined community, my argument, and this actually should appeal especially to young Pakistanis, is that the good thing about imagination is that an imagination need not be fixed. What you have imagined once, you can reimagine later. So the imagination can actually go through various kinds of mutations and transformations. And so, if we look at Pakistan's history and realize that our founding fathers and subsequent to them, our rulers, chose to create an ideological paradigm for Pakistan in which the military was most important. And there's a historic reason why Pakistan ended up with a stronger military. In the partition, Pakistan got about 19% of British India's population, 17% of its revenue sources, and 33% of its army. Much larger portion of the army than of either the revenue sources or the total population. And so that army then became the defining institution for the country. But it need not be that forever. Pakistanis can try and reimagine Pakistan in which the army is part of Pakistan, but not necessarily the dominant factor in Pakistan. Pakistanis see the country and the future of their country as something other than that of a warrior nation, in which the military must dominate and military factors must determine all aspects of national policy. Second, the overemphasis on the Islamic ideology, I think is something that a lot of Pakistanis are now realizing has created less advantage for Pakistan and caused more disadvantages for Pakistan. Because while in the beginning it sounded good, we are all one because we are Muslims and we will live by the principles of Islam, The second stage was far more difficult. What are the principles of Islam that we will live by? Who is a true Muslim? What kind of Islamic rules shall we make for the country? So Pakistan started out in 1947 with Shias and Ahmadis and Sunnis and Wahhabis and Ahl Hadith and Ismailis and Bohras and all kinds of religious denominations that considered themselves Muslim wanting Pakistan. And yet within a few years the debate had started. Should the Ahmadis, who believe that there is a prophet who came after Prophet Muhammad, be considered Muslims for legal purposes? That debate lasted for almost 20 years before it was resolved through a constitutional amendment. The only country of the world's 193 sovereign states that are members of the United Nations that has actually amended its constitution to decide whether a particular sect was part of a particular religion or not. Now, every now and then, I'm sure, since I see such bright faces in this audience, I'm sure many of you have many interesting friends in this country, because after all, a significant portion of the American electorate is evangelical Christian. If you run into some of them, they will tell you such and such. Catholics, not really Christian, Mormons, far away from being Christian, etc., etc. You probably hear those arguments. Similarly, within Judaism, there are those who would argue that Reform Jews are no longer Jews, or that a certain sect of the Hasidim is not as Jewish as they ought to be, etc. But here's the difference. None of it finds its way into legislation or constitutional law. In case of Pakistan, the Ahmadis, who consider themselves a sect of Islam, a Sunni offshoot, they have been legally declared non-Muslims for the purpose of the constitution and law of Pakistan. And every Pakistani who applies for a passport as a Muslim, because your passport has to indicate whether you're a Muslim or not in case you want to go and do pilgrimage to Makkah, for example, in your lifetime, every Pakistani is required to sign a declaration that disavows Ahmadi beliefs and says that I do not consider Ahmadis Muslims, I do not consider their prophet as an actual prophet, and I consider all those who believe that he's a prophet to be imposters and unbelievers. And only then can you get a passport as a regular Muslim. Why do I cite this? I cite this because these are the kind of anomalies that have been created by trying to create a more Islamic state. Instead of uniting, it has become a divisive factor. So now that the Ahmadis have been declared, now a new debate has started. Should the Shias be considered Islamic for the purpose of the constitution? And there's a movement in Pakistan called the Sipahi Sahaba, which demands that Shias too should be declared. So that basically, in pure demographic terms, scares me. Because in the end, if somebody's sitting in judgment on somebody else as, who is a true Muslim or not, we will end up actually diminishing the number of Muslims in Pakistan rather than increasing it. Lastly, creating a confessional state will always result in sectarian and ideological conflict. There's a famous figure of speech about how many angels can dance on the head of a pin, kind of religious argument. Similar arguments exist in Islam. Did Prophet Muhammad have a shadow or not? If he was made of the light of God, did he have a shadow or not? There are two Sunni sects that disagree on this. But should that be a matter to be discussed in Parliament, or should that be something that should influence legislation? Does it have any relevance for modern life? Does it have any relevance for increasing Pakistan's exports, increasing the number of Pakistan's educated people, improving Pakistan's skilled labor force, making Pakistan competitive in modern terms? So, the reimagining of Pakistan would have to involve also giving up this ideological paradigm. And what that would mean is that today, Pakistanis are taught in schools and colleges that we are Pakistanis because of a certain historic reality, because we have a shared ideology that makes us Pakistani. Instead of that, what we need to now do, the reimagined Pakistan that I talk about, would tell young people that you are Pakistanis because you were born in a country called Pakistan. And that, by the way, is not that difficult to do. There are many countries in the world that, if you go into their origins, have very unusual origins. Why should Belgium not be divided up between the Netherlands and France? The Dutch-speaking part being part of the Greater Netherlands and the French-speaking part being part of France. Belgium is just the former Spanish Netherlands that ended up then being set up as the Kingdom of Belgium in 1830. Not a very long time, about. But what made Belgium survive so long? There is a Belgian identity, and there are some very sweet things associated with Belgium, including Belgian chocolate. Here's what made the difference. Belgium did not see itself as a warrior nation with a destiny to compete with one of its larger neighbors. If the Belgians had decided in 1830 that they will overcome or compete with France, which is 6 times larger than Belgium, or they will compete with or overcome Germany, which is also much larger than Belgium, then Belgium would have had to make a whole lot more chocolate than it does to be able to be competitive. In fact, a reimagined Pakistan would have to A, shed its ideological baggage and ideological identity, B, embrace the fact that it's a geographic entity, and C, come to terms with its diversity. Diversity, especially in ethnic terms. 54% of Pakistanis right now are ethnic Punjabis. But the ethnic Punjabis account for 72% of Pakistan's military, and a significantly more than 54%, their population size, share in Pakistan's civil bureaucracy. What does that do? It does not make the other ethnic groups feel equal parts of Pakistan. So, if you have one ethnic group that is dominant over others, what would that do? It's not easy to say, you know what, we are the strongest, we are the biggest, we have the largest share of the military, and therefore we are going to dominate you. Usually, in all such situations, an ideological paradigm has to be created. So if you think about it, it was only through the communist ideology that the Russians were able to dominate the Soviet Union. Why should you accept Russian domination if you are Tajik or Uzbek or Georgian or Ukrainian? Well, guess what? We are part of the great Soviet Union, which is trying to do something very different for the world. We are trying to change the world and bring Marxist-Leninist ideology into reality and manifest itself. And that's what's happened in Pakistan. Islamic ideology has been used essentially to be able to perpetuate the ethnic domination of one group instead of a federation of partners that all have a share in the major decisions about the country. So we've already covered ideological paradigm being shunned, giving up the idea of being a warrior nation and a military-dominated nation. Third, a more equal, fair federation that accepts its diversity instead of insisting that we will try to create one nation by enforcing everything from the top. Just to give you an example, India and Pakistan became independent on the same day in 1947. Pakistan decided that it will have only one national language, Urdu, which at that time was the mother tongue of only 2% of Pakistanis. But that was going to be enforced as the national language. India decided not to choose any national language. They now have 24 official languages. 24. If you have an Indian rupee banknote, it has like 24 languages written on it in very fine print. So fine that most people can't normally read it. But it's diversity of language. Today, which of the two countries feels relatively more at ease about its identity? The one with 24 languages or the one with one language? Switzerland, which also has 4 national languages, by the way. Does that have greater national unity, or does our country, Pakistan? So, Pakistan needs to reimagine itself on that score as well. Diversity is sometimes better rather than insistence on unity that is enforced. The 5th factor for reimagining Pakistan would have to be a more honest analysis and appraisal of our history. Both after the creation of Pakistan, for example, events like why did we lose half our population? Why did the people of Bangladesh after an election decide that they didn't want to be part of Pakistan? Usually it's minorities that want to break away and separate. In case of Pakistan, it was the majority that chose to become a separate country. Why did that happen? What happened? Why did we end up with the situation that we have today, for example, of the jihadis and all kinds of terrorist groups operating out of Pakistan? A more honest discussion of that, but also going back into history. Pakistan's school children are taught a historic narrative in which somehow the subcontinent became Muslim as a result of conquest rather than as a result of Sufis spreading the doctrine. Islam, for example, came to the subcontinent actually long before the first conqueror set foot on the subcontinent, through traders that came to the south coast of India and brought along with them preachers and people who intermarried and etc. But the Pakistani version of history is essentially one that emphasizes conquerors over scholars and Sufis. That needs to change as well. And the last point that we need to change is Pakistan's overall global strategy of seeking global importance by virtue of military alliances. Now, I've written an entire book on that, and by the way, I'm a shameless promoter of things, that's something I'm learning from a certain presidential candidate. If you've written a book, promote it. If you've got a brand, put it up on the rooftop. It's a great book, I think, even though I say so myself. It's called Magnificent Delusions, and it's a historic account of US-Pakistan relations. How did Pakistan end up becoming so close to the United States that now Pakistanis blame everything on America, and Americans can't seem to know how to sort of get away from this partnership, even though they have much more economic interests with other neighbors of Pakistan, including India, Iran, and Afghanistan. And that was just the result of circumstances. It was a Cold War. India wanted to be non-aligned. Afghanistan wanted to be non-aligned. Iran was more engaged in the Middle East rather than in South Asia. Pakistan was the only country that was willing to allow America to use it as a base for intelligence and covert operations. Anybody who's seen Bridge of Spies, the U-2 flight took off from Pakistan, etc., etc. But that was good from the point of view of being able to sustain that large army that we had inherited. But if we are going to look at the future with the perspective of benefiting our 180, 190 million people, then a limited military partnership based on quid pro quo and transactional advantages is just not going to cut it. At the end of the day, Pakistan will have to grow its economy rather than depend on handouts from the United States, or for that matter from China. Pakistan will have to make decisions that have to be internally directed. Pakistan, for example, today is one of the world's largest producers of cotton. But if you look at Pakistan's export profile, Bangladesh, which does not produce cotton, has higher volume in higher value of exports of cotton products. Why? Because they have a more skilled manpower which goes into producing garments which have greater value addition than just raw cotton. So those are the things that Pakistan needs to move into changing itself. Just to summarize, I would say that a reimagination of Pakistan is necessary for the younger generation of Pakistan, which is stuck with the mistakes of the elders. An ideological Pakistan will continue to be a center of jihadi extremism. A militarized Pakistan will continue to be a source of conflict in South Asia, whether with India or with Afghanistan. Only a Pakistan that looks at itself not as a nation sitting at the crossroads of conflict, but as a nation sitting at the crossroads of opportunity. A more pragmatic Pakistan. A Pakistan where a Sindhi, a Baluch, a Pashtun, a Mahajir, a Gilgit-Baltistan resident, a person from Azad Kashmir and from Punjab, all feel part of a community of ethnicities that all are part of a democratic nation, with each group assured of their linguistic and cultural and ethnic rights, and yet a Pakistan that strives to be globally connected. I didn't even go, I have like several pages of statistics. Pakistan, for example, on global connectedness, falls far short of many, many countries that are even, and is less globally connected than many countries that are poorer than Pakistan. Pakistan's elite doesn't recognize it, by the way. Those of us who are Western educated, exposed, we don't realize it. Those of us who have ended up in other countries with green cards or with foreign passports as well as a result of Pakistan's dual nationality law, we don't realize it. But Pakistan, for example, ties with Afghanistan among the number of countries whose citizens need more visas to go to most countries than any other. That basically limits the Pakistani ability to be part of the rest of the world. And in terms of technology, while we have these very smart Pakistanis who are sitting in Silicon Valley, individuals, as a whole, our own country is not that vibrant an actor in the global technology market. In terms of new patents, Pakistan is almost nowhere in terms of the countries that register new patents. So what it needs is a total change in the way we look at the world. Do we want to be a country that derives its pride from its warriors, its soldiers, size of its army, size of its nuclear arsenal, or are we going to derive pride from having a nation that actually looks after its people, whose people are welcomed all over the world? Pakistan can't achieve any of that unless we begin, first of all, by ending this perennial competition we have with our much larger neighbor, with whom we are almost in a race in which we are running out of breath and yet not being able to catch up. We need to redefine Pakistani nationalism, not in militaristic terms, not in terms of competition with others, not in ideological terms, but in terms of the prosperity of our people. I'll stop here. I'm sure there's much that I have given out as food for thought and will result in some good and interesting questions. Thank you all very much.
Ambassador Haqqani, really fascinating talk. So many fascinating points to discuss, but I want to give the group here as much time as possible to talk. I want to just bring up a few ideas that your comments brought up for me. First of all, I think it is eminently appropriate for you to be using the framing mechanism of Professor Anderson, who unfortunately just left us quite recently, but the notion of imagining a nation is quite brilliant, and as some of our students here, I'm looking at one of my students now, and I don't think we've had a conversation in this entire year that we haven't talked somewhat about Benedict Anderson and imagining nations. So it really is a brilliant framing mechanism and discussion device. And actually it does remind me of something, I think it was Zia who said that, asking the question of what it is that makes Pakistani a Pakistani, and that was back in the 1980s, Zia Haq. He said to be, and he was a very religious person, there are really only two things that unite Pakistan: Islam and cricket, and not in that order, which may actually be accurate. And it reminds me, I'll say one more thing about that in a second. But it was very interesting, she brought up Professor Morgenthau's comments about the role of religion in Pakistan, the increasing role in public discourse in particular, and that was back in the 1950s. But I would like to raise for discussion the issue of whether or not it is religion that inevitably leads to militarization. I think that is an impression that his comment gives, and I think it's highly questionable. Is it religion in general, or in this case Islam in particular, that would, being elevated to a prominent place in national discourse, lead then somehow to making people more prone to violence? I think is the language that he used. And by the way, Pakistan is not the only country that didn't make sense to him in 1956. There was another country that was created in the same way, by the same people, and the only other country that was ever created in the modern world on the basis of religious identity, and that's Israel. Why did suddenly Israel make sense to him and Pakistan didn't? Neither one of them still makes sense in that context, but that's a different discussion. Maybe you can collaborate with Israel in reimagining these countries. In particular, I would like to discuss your proposition that it is very important for Pakistan to give up its ideological paradigm, by which I think, I mean, you were talking about the militarization, but I think it's somehow linked with religion, and that's the part I would like to call into question. Could it not be said that there would be a reimagining of public discourse about Islam? The public discourse about Islam, the popular discourse about Islam that came into prominence, partly in the 70s during Zulfikar Ali Bhutto's regime, in which he gave prominence to certain religious factions who were anti-Ahmadi, and then even more so during the 1980s under Zia-ul Haq. Isn't it possible to simply call into question that particular interpretation of Islam, which was quite militarized? And that, of course, too, would help with your project, which I think is very important. All the projects you brought up are very important and integrally related, but with the question of a more honest approach to history. As people began to forget that Pakistan is an acronym, they began to think of Pakistan, that is the land of the pure. Well, pure, which is, of course, not a proper term, but pure relative to what? Somehow other people who are impure. Those are not fundamental or foundational concepts in Islam. There are other ways to teach Islam rather than that particular 1970s and 1980s politically expedient approach to Islam. So that, as well as the question of Pakistan accepting its pluralism. As you noted, Pakistan's pluralism is primarily not religious. I mean, there are some aspects of religious pluralism, but primarily ethnic. So what about reimagining not necessarily the ideology of Pakistan, but education in Pakistan about other ways to understand Islam rather than those that are privileged as a result of the poverty of Pakistan? That is, when people get donations to teach religion, they teach their kind of religion, and rather than other kinds of other Muslims' approach to religion, as well as reimagining the governance of Pakistan. The governance of Pakistan, which does privilege Punjabis and Sindhis vis-a-vis people from KPK, or in particular Balochistan, people who have good reason to be upset about maldistribution of resources. So that leads me with a toss-out comment. There are groups who are gravitating toward an approach to reimagining Pakistan's governance on the basis of what followers believe is a more authentic or more acceptable to younger generations, whom you say there are the majority, and it's quite true. And reimagining Islamic teaching, re-examining Pakistani governance, and in particular stressing education and fair distribution of resources, and that is, of course, the great cricketer, Imran Khan's PTI. I mean, I actually am a fan of cricket. So there are those approaches to reimagining Pakistan that don't call for the overhauling of the foundational ideology. So that's something that I think would be great fun to discuss. But thank you so much for such an enlightening presentation. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to do something totally shameless, and I'm going to abuse my power, the moderator, to actually moderate between their two positions. One thing that and by the way, he has written 2 fabulous books, and the other one, sir, you have to plug your
Pakistan
book.
between mosque and military.
There was my South Asia class, you know it, because we
New
actually.
edition coming up.
Mashallah.
New chapters. Taking it all the way to 2015.
Mashallah, alhamdulillah. From the Punjabis in the room. Okay, because I'm an inner Punjabi. Okay, so the one thing, so I actually think that you did not mention once the two-nation theory, but I know you, and we've had Twitter DMs back and forth, and I've seen your op-eds. And this kind of tweezes, or brings together some of the things that you were saying in his critique. The two-nation theory was fundamentally not democratic. The two-nation theory, and you were absolutely correct that today there is no ethnic diversity or religious diversity. That's because the two-nation theory drove out 1/4 of its original population, which in fact were not Muslims. And so one of the problems with the two-nation theory, apart from the fact, and the Muslim League that initiated itself was not a democratic party. So, you know, when I teach my South Asia class, everyone says Pakistan and India were equal inheritors of the Raj, and I'm like, no they weren't. They were in no way equal inheritors of the Raj by any measure. The parties themselves were very different. But the two-nation theory itself, from the beginning, said that those non-Muslim citizens of Pakistan were not welcome. And in fact, the very choice of imposing Urdu, when no one in Pakistan spoke Urdu, and in fact the majority of Pakistan actually spoke Bengali. And I like to propose a counterfactual in my class. What if Jinnah had not been an Urdu promoter who didn't believe that the strategic center of Pakistan was the West, and in fact conceded to democracy, which is that Bangla should be the national language, and that the center, or the capital of Pakistan, should be Dhaka, not Karachi. We would imagine, in other words, if he had been a Democrat, instead of, in fact, another viceroy. But you didn't mention the two-nation theory, but I want you to talk about it, because that actually addresses some of her issues. And once you had the objectives resolution, which was passed, which basically says Pakistan is going to be under the law of Allah, not man, you gave a permanent job to the ulama to do what you were actually saying, which is decide who is a Muslim. So that, I think, is part of this ideological reimagining. Because I've read your op-eds about this, and I think they're spot on. But then there is a real problem. It's true that you can reimagining doesn't require you to rehearse the past. But this is a real question, not a comment. You know, I taught in LUMS a number of years ago, and I deal with a lot of Pakistanis in social media, and you should see the hate mail I get. I'm going to one day write a book, The Things Pakistani Males Say to Me. It's really fabulous. I'm going to have to hire someone outrageous to narrate it. But the thing that amazes me is that Pakistan's not North Korea, right? The generals of North Korea can sustain basically fictions as ossified fact because they're generally isolated from the rest of the world. Pakistanis rehearse fictions all the time. So, for example, the United States began jihad, not true as you noted in your book, sir. Actually, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto began it in 1974. You call, Pakistanis call in their textbooks the 1940 Lahore Declaration, the 1940 Pakistan Resolution. There was no mention of Pakistan, there was no mention of partition, in fact, it called for the creation of Muslim states. Pakistani textbooks and media and ISPR says India has started every war and Pakistan won every war. These are simply empirical Bakwas episodes. And Pakistan has never been isolated from the world, even at its highest point of being a pariah for the Taliban, Osama bin Laden. It's never been isolated. So what accounts for this enduring and accumulation of fiction that so many Pakistanis rehearse in their curriculum and elsewhere as fact, despite this thing called empiricism? How do you puncture this bubble of nonsense?
That's a more difficult question, but before I come to that, let me begin by saying that the reason why I didn't mention the two nation theory and Imran Khan is because I thought I should talk about more relevant subjects than those that have become redundant under the circumstances. Cricket, look, I mean, it's a great line from Ziaul Haq, but the truth of the matter is that cricket doesn't unify nations. Pakistan's cricket team is essentially composed of one ethnic group, by and large, with a few people from Karachi thrown in. Nobody in Balochistan plays cricket. So these are these cliches that we have, and we make them into discourse. Similarly, it's not only Pakistanis who have a problem with history. People who work on Pakistan here, many of them embrace these things. For example, Islamization goes all the way back to 1949 with the Objectives Resolution. It's a systematic. Bhutto may have expanded it because of 1971. Half of the country went away. He actually had a conference in Pakistan between mosque and military, I cite that, where he actually had a conference and said, can we have a new basis for our national identity? You know, and the scholars showed up, and half of them said, well, yeah, we could, because we could be a voluntary unit, and then the other half said, no, it has to, and it was the military that pushed for the Islamic identity. And people forget that between 1947 and 1958, Pakistan did not declare itself an ideological state. It was Field Marshal Ayub Khan who declared Pakistan an ideological state. Jinnah never used the word ideological state. Liaquat Ali Khan never used the word ideological state. The word ideological state was first used by Ayub Khan, who in his book, Friends Not Masters, actually makes extremely racist statements about Pakistan's own majority population, the Bengalis, and then about Hindus. And so what it was this Hindu-Muslim sort of oversimplified paradigm which was used, which, now I agree that religion is not necessarily the reason for militarization, but Pakistan's experience is one of militarization through religion. Because the whole idea, for example, in the 65 war, Ayub Khan's calculus was that a Muslim fights better than 5 Hindus. He said it explicitly. And of course, Nehru being, having a sense of humor, and his successor, Shastri, was a successor at that time. And some of them came up with the idea that, you know, if Nehru used to say, if we ever have a war with Pakistan, I'll make sure that every 5th commander is a Muslim. And in 1965, that's what they did. They actually found all the Muslim officers in the Indian army to try and have a 5th Muslim commander, so that they could actually prove to the Pakistanis that your basic idea is wrong. It's not Muslim versus Hindu. There's some long-term standing historic paradigm that's been created over the years. After all, during the Mughals, the two communities lived a lot more harmoniously. Otherwise, there wouldn't have been an empire the way it was if there hadn't been greater harmony. So the whole history has been, it's a contrived history. And here I would slightly disagree that while Israel may not make sense to people, Israel actually does track itself through an internal argument of history. There was an Israeli state, there was an Israel in history that we are trying to recreate. Whereas there was no Pakistan in history that we are trying to create, which is why some people said we are trying to recreate the state of Medina, you know, the state that Prophet Muhammad had. Because it is a serious problem for those who want a historic explanation for why they are members of a nation instead of a voluntary union of ethnicities. And yes, I agree that Pakistan's diversity right now is more ethnic than religious. There is a religious overlay as well, which has to be understood. It's actually just below the surface. The proportions, for example, of various Islamic sects vary between various parts of the country. And so therefore, and then how people approach religion. The Sindhis historically were always Sufis. They were much more at ease living with other groups. So for example, Hindus attended the shrines of Muslims, Muslim saints. Baluch have a very relaxed approach to religion compared to the other. The Pashtuns were divided between those who were sort of, you know, a little more orthodox, and then those who were had a more South Asian vision or version of religion. Punjab is where basically in 1947 the real ethnic and religious clashes came. All the communal riots, etc. were concentrated in Punjab. East Punjab was totally cleansed of Muslims. And West Punjab was totally cleansed of Hindus and Sikhs. So the East Punjabi migrants in Pakistan have actually been the strongest advocates of an Islamic state. If you look at the characters, cast of characters, Maulana Maududi, even though he was from Hyderabad, Deccan, but his base was in East Punjab before he moved to Pakistan. Chaudhry Muhammad Ali, who was our Prime Minister at one time, he came from East Punjab. Ziaul Haq came from East Punjab. So a lot more for those of you who are aspiring PhD candidates looking for a thesis idea, here's one. And that is to understand these interconnections between ethnicity, religiosity, and ideology. And if Pakistan is to be reimagined, it actually will require puncturing this balloon of false history. Pakistan was inevitable because Muslims and Hindus never lived together. You know, really. Pakistan was going to be the safe haven for Muslims of South Asia. Excuse me, at no point was 1/3 of the population that was going to be left behind in India going to be part of Pakistan. So it would have been only 2/3, at best 2/3 could have had a country. But more important, if the original demand for Pakistan, which meant that the British provinces with a Muslim majority had been put into the state of Pakistan, which means that Punjab had not been divided further and Bengal had not been divided, Pakistan would have emerged with 56% Muslims and 44% non-Muslims. I mean, that's a demographic difference that actually can be overcome in like 2 or 3 census cycles, 6, 7, 8%. So what exactly was going to be accomplished? So there was never going to be all Muslims in one state and all Hindus in one. There was no ethnic cleansing envisaged. It was an accident, the way it happened, the violence, etc. that caused it, no, not planned. So there were certain serious conceptual flaws which have been covered and papered over by manufactured history. Then you have this military that has dominated the country. Now when you have a dominant military cannot accept a narrative in which it has lost every war. So therefore they have to invent the narrative in which they have won every war, and basically it's a very smart thing. I mean, you know, all you have to do is find the anniversary of the war and declare it Victory Day. And so it doesn't mean you have to win the war. Everybody else in the world may think you lost it, but you can say that we won it. And then you can stretch history a little bit again, you know, blame it all. For example, 1971 in Pakistani discourse, increasingly Zulfikar Ali Bhutto is blamed for it without acknowledging the fact that the man who actually held the cards and controlled the country at that time was an army general, Yahya Khan. And the person who surrendered to the Indians was an army general. So, but that's all airbrushed. And the ideology and militarism serve each other. You must note that Pakistan's, for example, right now in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, there's a coalition government between PTI and Jamaat-e-Islami. And Jamaat-e-Islami demanded the education portfolio. And what did they do with the education portfolio? They used it to change the textbooks in a manner in which the historic role of Ghaffar Khan would be kind of wiped out. The entire debate, even in
You should explain who that is, especially in light of the terrorist attack last week.
Ghaffar Khan, Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan, also known as Bacha Khan, was a Pashtun leader who did not agree with the creation of Pakistan. And he was,
Frontier Gandhi.
Yeah, he's also known as the Frontier Gandhi. He advocated non-violence, and he was the most popular Pashtun leader before the creation of Pakistan. And after the creation of Pakistan, he spent a great deal of time in prison, etc. And always his followers still remain influential in the politics of Northwest Pakistan, Pashtun politics of Pakistan. And so going back to the curriculum changes, they want to paint a narrative in which essentially, so Bacha Khan doesn't exist. The fact that people of Pashtunkhwa didn't vote for the creation of Pakistan, the fact that the people of Balochistan were never asked to vote, all of that has to be airbrushed to
They never
create
had
a...
assembly to vote. They never had assembly to
Yeah,
vote.
so there's been an airbrushing of history, and then because Pakistan became an American ally, there are people in America, whether they be in American governments successively or American academia, etc., who kind of have this very soft approach to Pakistan. It's very interesting. Read British scholars on the creation of Pakistan, read American scholars, with some notable exceptions. But there's a general tendency, instead of understanding that here is essentially a state that was created under very complex circumstances, and now basically it's people, if they want to be part of one country, they have the right to build a new democratic country. But a militarized state, under an army that wasn't, most countries raise an army for the threat they face, right? Pakistan inherited an army and had to create a threat to match the size of its army. That's a very fundamental thing that people need to understand about the process through which all of that came. Which is why I say that this reimagining process will actually have to focus a great deal on cleaning up that whole mess that has been created with this oversimplified ideological history and militarized history, in which we Pakistanis did nothing wrong, everything wrong was done to us by the rest of the world. India is the biggest bully on earth, but then the Americans are fair weather friends who've never been nice to us. The rest of the world constantly conspires against us. For God's sake, even the fact that we now have a higher occurrence of floods is the result of a Zionist Hindu conspiracy, because they now have technology whereby they manipulate floods in our country. By the way, go Google it. Just put in the words HAARP, hard, and Pakistan floods together. You will find a whole bunch of articles saying that. And we are also, unfortunately, the only country where a physics PhD who headed our atomic energy program at the time actually wrote an academic paper, ostensibly academic paper, saying that the solution to the world's energy problems, because I'm a Muslim and I believe in the Quran, and the Quran talks about jinns who are made of fire, therefore the solution to the world's energy problem, beginning with Pakistan's energy problem, is actually greater prayer to bring the jinns into the service of mankind so that they can generate the energy for everybody. The guy has a PhD in physics from a British university.
There's two other things that you did which was really important. We also calculated the exact number of angels that can dance on the head of a pin, and you also calculated the exact temperature of hell. And the funny thing is, I grew up in an evangelical background, and we also had pamphlets that we would get at the Good News Club that said the exact temperature of hell and the number of angels that can dance on the head of a pin. So I've got that with him. In Bashir, we have that.
Yeah, his name is Dr. Bashiruddin Mahmood. The reason why I cite these things
he also met the Taliban, and Osama bin Laden, trying to sell them nuclear.
But the reason is actually kind of, I do like ringing the alarm bell, especially for Pakistan. Young Pakistanis are Pakistan's hope, but they are not Pakistan's hope if they're going to buy into this kind of narrative. So whenever I have an audience in which I see even two Pakistani faces, I actually start talking to those two rather than the rest of the crowd. You have to come to terms with the fact that the reason why the world sees us as a problem is because we have a problem. Try to think from the point of view of being an average American professor at an American university, a physics professor who reads this paper, and he says, oh God, this guy heads their nuclear program? Boy, are we in trouble? You know, that kind of thing. And so therefore, that's why when people, I mean, I know, I'm called all kinds of names in Pakistan, from traitor to American agent to Jewish agent to Hindu agent,
Are they
whatever.
all paying you? I hope so.
What?
all those agencies that are paying, I hope you're being paid.
Well, I think I've got the invoices sitting on my desktop. We'll send them one day and probably collect everything. But the point is not this assumption that there's a great grand conspiracy occurring against Pakistan, and that those who point out some flaws and ask some questions about Pakistan's functioning, that they are somehow engaging in treasonous conduct, is part of the problem. And the reimagined Pakistan will have to open its mind to everything. There's no problem. I mean, okay, so we can have two opinions. You can say that Qaid-e-Azam Muhammad Ali Jinnah was a perfect leader, but there were some Muslims like Bacha Khan who were good guys, but they disagreed with him. What's the big deal? That, you know, Pakistan's creation at that time, there were very legal complications, etc., which the British helped smooth by holding a referendum in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa instead of letting the assembly vote, because the assembly would have voted against. And then in Balochistan, just getting a few tribal leaders to endorse, etc. Things like that. And then East Pakistan went, you know, I mean, countries break up. Yugoslavia is broken up. But we, if we do not want to break up and keep the current Pakistan, then we will have to think of it very differently. It will have to be a Pakistan that actually earns its keep in the world by virtue of its productivity, by virtue of its energy, by virtue of its contribution to the global sort of, well-being, instead of being seen as a problem that people should pay for. You know, when I was ambassador in this very town, I remember once a whole delegation came from Pakistan and somebody had given them these talking points. So they would go to every American congressman, senator, State Department, and they would say, the war against terror is costing Pakistan billions of dollars. And the reason why we are stuck in this is because you made us fight the Russians, and then since then we have these jihadis. So now you have to make up, and then they would take out sheets of paper which had lists of how much loss Pakistan was incurring because of the war against terror, and they wanted Uncle Sam to compensate Pakistan. And so when the first time I heard it, I just called them all into my office and I said, on the one hand we say we are a proud nation. What proud nation presents a bill to other countries for its failings and weaknesses? It's time we correct course for our own sake, not for the sake of X amount of dollars from other countries who we say are responsible for putting us into this situation.
All right, so I'm going to take some questions. Arun.
Yeah.
Arun, I should know that. I've been here for years. Just shoot me now. Arun is going to go first. And I'm sure you presented some of those memos, right, sir? This is a fellow from Parks and MC. So I would I would ask that you not speechify, because I actually have a family crisis, and I actually have to drive to Indiana imminently. So questions only, no speeches. And we'll do Q&A for 15 minutes, and I got to get out of here. So Arun, you first.
Ambassador Haqqani, thank you so much, and Professor Fair. It's really great seeing all of you here. Thank you for your talk. I agree. I think that when you walk into a room, it's always very tempting to speak to the Pakistani students in the audience. Having said that, I think that there's a lot of people from Pakistan who are now present in the United States who probably supported you much more than you imagine. And I know they're not terribly vocal. They're definitely not the people who, for example, attack people like you on Twitter. They're the people who would defend you, but they're not very public. I guess my question to you is, why come in here and point out the crazies, right? I mean, there are crazies in India that I could point out as well. Swamis who say that women should not walk around while they're on their period. Crazy things like that, or they deserve to be raped or whatever. But at the same time, why not talk about the fact that what happened during your tenure as ambassador, when the civilian government, for a hot moment, tried to take something back from the army, and there was a major crisis which has probably led to the reason why you probably have not been able to enter that country again. Let's talk about the Pakistanis who are actually trying to reclaim space in much the same way that you were talking about. What's the resistance right now? A lot of us don't believe in the two-nation theory the same way. But at the same time, we're like, well, this is what we have. Yeah. Now what do we do? Right? Why is it that an ambassador like yourself, who managed to come up with not only questioning the army's role in civilian processes in Pakistan, but the army's role in coming to Washington, D.C., much like Rahil Sharif did just this year, to be given that kind of reception by the American state? There's one thing to say that this country that has struggled with democracy since its inception has given this outsized role to the military in its own country. The world's most powerful, most democratic country is doing exactly the same. It's reinforcing the role of that person who has no business being. He's not the head of state. So why don't we talk a little bit about what happened to your civilian government when it tried to get some of its back?
Good point. I think that you more or less, it's a very cleverly phrased question because it's an answer with a question mark at the end of it. The only real question there was, why bring up the crazy? I don't bring up the crazies, and I don't bring them up deliberately. It just came in the course of conversation. And I know that there are Swamis in India and there are people in America and all that. And unless somebody gets the nomination in the presidential election, crazies by and large are kept like as crazies. And the big difference is that I worry about my country, that sometimes the crazies are actually much more responsible positions. So having a guy who believes in jinns and wants to control them to be able to change the world's energy situation ended up becoming head of the nuclear program. That worries me. That's the only reason why that came up. Otherwise, I wouldn't have even dwelt on it. As far as the civil military question is concerned, look, I agree with you that there are many people, not only here, but even in Pakistan, who believe that. But you know, they make examples. So for example, I have been made an example for all of you who may want to do this again. And that, you know, if you're going to raise certain harsh questions, you'll never be forgiven and you'll be constantly targeted, accused and abused. That said, I think that it's going to be a multi-faceted, multi-year project to actually gain sufficient space in Pakistan, and it's multi-tiered. For example, civil military space has to be gained for the civilians. Now obviously when the civilians gain space, the civilians are not going to be the perfect civilians, because the guys who will gain space may actually be flawed civilians. Then among the civilians there will have to be, between the smarter and better civilians and the bad civilians, then there are going to be governance issues, then there are going to be ethnic issues, we already see them. And then at the international level we have to understand that, and my second book, Magnificent Delusions, actually goes into it in great detail. And in my own experience, and I've dealt with American officials, etc., as ambassador, private citizen, academic, basically Americans are very good at dealing with enemies. They know who to bomb. Americans are very good at dealing with so-called friends or allies. They know who to take out for lunch. They get very confused with states and countries with whom they are friends on a couple of issues and not friends on a couple of issues. And it's a long history. I mean, you know, they're kind of constantly doing that. And then the Pakistani military actually has perfected the script. They have perfected the script. And they have perfected the script. Our civil servants are far too weak. You won't believe it. When I was ambassador, I used to write very candid cables because I am a writer myself, so I used to write them myself. And my staff, foreign service people, would come and say, "Sir, make it softer." For example, if I met a senator and the senator said to me, "You know, your country's intelligence service is a bunch of thugs," I would actually put it in inverted commas, and I'd say, "Senator so-and-so said to me that the ISI are a bunch of thugs." And the foreign service guy would say, "No, soften this. Don't put it in inverted commas, say he said something negative about the ISI, so that back home we don't have to tell them that." I was very candid. So on the one hand we have the military, then we have the foreign service and our civil service that has become very cowed down. Then we have, as a result, one of the lasting consequences of the Afghan war against the Soviets is not jihadism, because jihadism has been there for longer. I always put every 17th or 16th of December, I put the Dawn front page on my Twitter feed, you know, and that had jihad in big letters on it. So jihad has been there all along. The lasting consequence of the war against the Soviets is the absolute ballooning of Pakistan's intelligence service. The ISI is much larger than an intelligence service of any country proportionate to its size that Pakistan has. And it has a role in almost everything. Media management, supporting Zaid Hamed and his fantasy ideas, running conspiracy theories.
Spying on ambassadors.
Following ambassadors. One of my favorite stories from my era as ambassador is when one day my cook came and said that there's been an embassy car's been going around our house, the ambassador's house. So I said, "Oh, who do you think?" And he told me that the car belonged to one of the ISI people in the embassy. So I said, "Okay, don't go out, just stay home. I'm going to do something about it." I called up diplomatic security and I said, "This is the Pakistani ambassador. And there's somebody with fake license plate in a car going around my house. It's a security threat to me." So obviously I knew that they will come and they'll apprehend the guy, and that will expose the fact that he was from the embassy. And so his officer had to explain to me the next morning why he was, you know, trying to run surveillance on me, the ambassador. I'm his boss.
And bad surveillance.
Yeah, bad surveillance. Why does he do surveillance of the ambassador? But going back to the thing, the ISI is ballooning. So the ISI has a role in virtually everything, including building a national narrative and media and all that. There's no shortcuts. it's going to be a long fight. There's going to be people like me, it's going to be people after me who will push back. Look, every country loves its army. Most countries do. Here people have stickers saying, I support my troops and love my troops. But the fact of the matter is that the army is not ubiquitous. The army is not, like for example, the number of retired brigadiers who write newspaper articles or letters to the editor in Pakistan. It's very orchestrated. And that is what I mean by a militarized society. A whole, so-called think tanks that are run by intelligence services,
With fabulous acronyms, we have to give them credit for the acronyms.
And then, okay, so Christine Fair is an American professor, she is writing something. No big deal, you don't agree with her, write a book as a rejoinder, get somebody to do counter research and point out what's flawed with her research. You don't have to call her a B word or a W word, etc., etc.
Or threaten me with gang rape, which is my favorite.
And things like that. So what we have is an overblown KGB style, Stasi style intelligence service and trappings of democracy. And then, unfortunately, since he was brought up, people in Pakistan's politics, famous more for cricket than for politics, who are willing to play ball on their behalf and create illusions in Pakistani politics. So therefore, it's not going to be easy. That's the short answer to your question, but it's a battle worth fighting. I mean, I may have fallen in it, although I think I'm quite okay. But there are others who will have to fight it, because at the end, Pakistan can't be just its military. Pakistan has to be its people. Pakistan has to be social scientists, its economists, its artists, and Pakistan cannot have just one explanation for everything. There is room in Pakistan for people who think we should have peace with India at all costs. There should be room in Pakistan for people who think, what's our problem with Afghanistan? There should be room in Pakistan for people who think, you know what, all provinces should have autonomy. There should be room in Pakistan for people who think Pakistan needs to have a smaller army than we do. 2% of GDP is spent on education. 6% is spent on the military. And yet after spending 6%, we are nowhere near coming close in terms of going head to head with the country we are supposed to be building up against. So what are we doing, wasting all these resources? And yet, 35% of school-going age children don't go to any school.
So I'm nearsighted. Siraj, right?
Sure.
Yeah, Siraj. So you're going to go first, and I'm going to take three in a clump. So the fellow from the Pakistan embassy?
If he's from the embassy,
Oh, I'm
he still has that. He still
Agar
has that.
Bakhe. But where I'm going to take students first, if you don't mind. So Siraj,
Yeah.
yes, what's your name?
Yeah.
Oh, and then the young lady here behind the camera.
Amanda.
Amanda. So I'm going to take three of you first in the first batch. Please be crisp, concise, you two. And then hopefully we get a second round in.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Haqqani, for your wonderful presentation. My name is Malik Akbar. I'm a journalist. You have had a wonderful transition. You were once an activist for the Jamaat Islami, and then you are a staunch liberal in Pakistan now. What caused that transition? Because we have millions of young Pakistanis who are radicalized by the television channels, by Zaid Hamid type of people. What needs to be done to induct that transformation in the Pakistan youngsters who are picked up, who are radicalized by these jihadi or religious organizations? And you have had this personal experience from transitioning from Jamaat Islami to liberalism. What needs to be done? Do you have some suggestions that we could utilize in terms of de-radicalizing the Pakistan
You got your
youth?
question. Okay, you next. We're taking back to the three. Yes.
So it's generally the perception that education sort of is the counter thesis to radicalism. But after how the lawyers reacted in the Salman Taseer case, that was my Pakistani friends told me I don't know. But with more than 90% of Pakistani students going to madrasas for education. Not
Complete the question.
but it's what is your how do you reimagine that question, the education?
Amanda.
Given your Reimagine Pakistan calls for diversity within discourse and discourse that includes diversity, what do you think that the role of religion in the state should be in that vision?
You gave me the smartest and easiest question to answer. Look, very frankly, religion, a society can be religious, an individual can be pious, a society can be religious, but the state simply cannot be religious. All attempts to create religious states have failed, they have always undermined diversity, they have always ended up causing conflict. Because if nothing else, there's conflict about what type of religion or how it would be implemented. So therefore, my own view is that Pakistani society should continue to be religious and should continue to accept religion as an integral part of society, but we need to take it out of this business of state a little bit. That would be the beginning point. The answer to Yash's question is, it's not the mother-size, it's the schooling and it's the overall narrative. When you're told that the country was created because you couldn't live with another community forever, that and in all historic sort of events, you were wronged and you are the ones who are the victims, it creates a certain mindset. And then you're also supposed to be the best amongst people, and that you're going to recreate a golden era. So that's where a lot of the problem comes from. The narrative of the education, not. So for example, these lawyers, they study law, then there are engineers who study engineering, then there are doctors who study medicine. But when it comes to the worldview, they still have this kind of worldview. And they do not see, for example, many of them don't necessarily believe in democracy. Many of them believe that, they do not believe in empiricism. They believe in sort of, so that narrative needs to be tackled. And once that narrative, look, I'll just give you an example. Japan. It had an imperialist narrative. Japan was this most special, unique country whose emperor was God. And blessed by that God, Japan had the right to go and take over all of Asia. At the end of the Second World War, military defeat and nuclear strikes made first the emperor say, "I am no God." And second, Japanese society actually started revising and revisiting its own history. And there's still reluctance on certain issues. For example, when it came to apologizing for the so-called comfort women in Korea, Japan dragged its feet because that was the last thing you do. The last thing you do is apologize to women, etc. But some of them have come close to it. And that has helped. If Japan can overcome a military defeat and be nuked by revisiting its imperial past and saying, we did something wrong, then surely Pakistan, which has nukes, hasn't nuked anybody and hasn't been nuked, thank God, but surely it can revisit its own history and say, we did something wrong somewhere and this is how we need to change it. So that's what I think is needed. The Islamic triumphalist way of thinking, whether it comes from the madrasa or from the public school, needs to be changed. Islam is meant to create piety in your soul, not make you into rulers of the world or conquerors. The personal journeys are always difficult to explain. First of all, I was only on the fringes and the era I was born in and raised in, this kind of religious radicalism that we see today was not the case. I mean, Islamic groups were more about religion, a little bit about politics, and not about radicalism. The radicalism came after my era. But the only reason why I actually was able to outgrow it all was more knowledge of the world. The more knowledgeable I have become, the more I have reached the conclusion that exclusivism doesn't work. That, for example, as a young boy, I grew up in Karachi. I thought being a good man or a good person equals being a good Muslim. Then I traveled abroad, I was 18, 19, and I found people who were good people, but they were not Muslims. And I found Muslims who were not good people. And so that's the way it happened. Most important thing is change the idea of education from brainwashing to actually making people think. I think I was blessed that way. that my parents, etc., always, my father, for example, always asked me questions that were contrary to what was being taught in the school curriculum. You know, and I always looked for other materials and other sources. But this single-minded brainwashing approach really causes a lot of problems. So you have to have the ability to look at alternative views. A lot of the radicalism that we see is actually a outgrowth of Islamo-nationalism. Many people are not particularly religious in their private lives, and yet they are very radical. They are willing to kill the next person for Islam. They are not willing to sort of give arms for Islam. They'll chop off their arm for Islam, but they will not give arms for Islam. You know, so it's a phenomenon that needs to be fully understood. And in case of Pakistan, I'm absolutely convinced that the religion that we need to deal with is the religion that has been made part of this national identity and national discourse, not the religion that has to be personalized. I'm sure you know many people. My mother was an extremely religious person, God bless her soul, prayed 5 times a day, got up for tahajjud, did all kinds of things, fasted, and yet she was the gentlest person, never judged anybody, never commented on anybody, never wanted to enforce anybody. It's this idea that somehow this faith is going to inspire us into some kind of national success and victory. That is the bigger problem than just piety and religiosity.
Okay, one more round of questions, then we're going to close up. The fellow in the back, the fellow from the Pakistan Embassy, I presume you still have a question? Okay. So just, any other questions? Yes, Stanley? Oh, and yes, your name?
Ahmed.
Okay, so in that order, and then take 50 questions. You'll answer briefly, and then we will say good night and drive safely. Yes, sir.
I think I'm Jake Ansar from the Indo-American Foundation. We've met many times before. I think you would say that Pakistan's problem with radicalism in the institutions and such is not a it does not come from a vacuum or exist in a vacuum, but that the countries part of the Ummah per se contribute to it, such as those in the Gulf country. Can you unpack that as to the contributions of some of these countries to this idea of a militant Islamic state?
Okay. Stanley.
I'd like to ask you about the current tensions, particularly between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Prime Minister Sharif offered to mediate, that was immediately slapped down by the Saudi foreign minister, very publicly, I'm tempted to say undiplomatically. There has been sectarian tension already in Pakistan. How do you see this growing confrontation, really, between Iran and Saudi Arabia affecting Pakistan?
And then finally, your question.
I just have a question: who and how is going to translate this new reimagined idea of Pakistan to the majority of brutal people in Pakistan? Because you highlighted the educational difficulties in the system. Is it going to come from poor and educated Pakistanis? Is it going to come from the government? Is it going to come from the military? Who is going to do this empirically?
I do not know the who. I'm the ideas guy here. So I think if Karl Marx had waited to find out whether there was some Lenin waiting to act on his ideas, then I think The Capital wouldn't have been written. It's not a great book of literature in my opinion. But anyway, I'm just saying that as a point. So it's not. But I do expect the younger Pakistanis are actually looking for some kind of a template. And right now they're going with small bits and pieces, and so what I'm hoping to do is deliver just when I wrote Pakistan Between Mosque and Military, it was the first book that actually dug deep into explaining the connection between Pakistan's jihadis and Pakistan's militarism. And it developed into many other ideas. A lot of young people in Pakistan actually grew up realizing, you know what? These are not two separate things. It's not like, Musharraf is the savior and the jihadis are the bad guys. Actually, at some point, they're the one thing. And so I'm hoping that by coming up with a full explanation, I'll actually contribute to that discourse, and then somebody else who's younger than me and a little more engaged back home will probably bring about some change in that sense. Stanley's question. Saudi Arabia and Iran have both used Pakistan for a proxy war, but Pakistan's I think Pakistan doesn't have a place in this equation in terms of mediation, etc., because Pakistan's government and Pakistan's military are too beholden to the Saudis for the Iranians to be able to trust them. At the same time, the sectarian issues in Pakistan, while they are funded and fed by the rivalry between those two, are not purely the result of the rivalry between those two. So all I would say is that if the Iranians and the Saudis decide to turn the heat on, we will see a little more conflict in Pakistan than we do. But at the end of the day, Pakistan's internal issues have to be dealt by Pakistanis. And as far as the Saudi-Iranian rivalry is concerned, both of the, I personally feel right now it's less Saudi-Iranian rivalry than Saudis feeling a little resentful of the fact that Uncle Sam has kind of deserted them. And that's why they're trying to. Otherwise, there is an equilibrium in the Middle East that can be reached. Iran has its strengths, but it also has its weaknesses. The Shiite population of the world is about 15% of all Muslims. That's not big enough for Iran to actually try and sort of emerge as the Muslim world's leader. So Iran has to reach out to non-Shias. And Saudi Arabia has to reconcile to its size. I mean, I'm one of those who believe that, I say that about Pakistan too. I said that when I made the Belgian sort of reference, that nations must actually have foreign policy that is more or less tailored to their size. You can punch a little above your weight, but not too much above your weight. And I think that Saudi Arabia, in the period of high oil prices, etc., was able to punch far more above its weight, especially after 1979 and Iran's isolation and sanctions against Iran, than it should have. So that's what's causing that conflict rather than anything else. And I hope that at some point rationality will prevail. Iran will understand that it can't go beyond a certain level in manifesting its power, and Saudi Arabia recognizes the same about itself. And the question about everything not being in a vacuum. Yes and no. If you read Pakistan Between Mosque and Military, I point out that even in 1949-50, when the Arab world in particular was embracing Arab secularism and Arab nationalism, and Turkey was secular nationalist and Iran was secular nationalist, Pakistan was trying to invoke the Ummah or the idea of the Ummah. By 1962, Saudi Arabia had joined it. So it became Saudi money, Pakistani idea. If you think about it, the Mu'tamar al-Alam al-Islami, or the Muslim World League, operated out of Karachi for a long time. The Grand Mufti of Palestine lived in Karachi instead of living in a Middle Eastern capital, etc., etc. Pakistan does have a very unique place in all of this. And if you think about it, while right now we are going through a phase of radical Islam even in the Middle East, the truth of the matter is that the Arabs can very easily switch from religion to nationalism. Because after all, they are a nation based on language and culture and history. And the Indonesians will always have Indonesian identity. And this is one of the things, let's end it on it. Ziaul Haq used to say that if the Arabs stop being Muslim, they will still be Arabs. If the Iranians stop being Muslims, they'll still be Persians. If the Indonesians stop being Muslim, they'll still be Indonesian. What will Pakistanis be if we do not identify with the cause of Islam? So that's kind of a greater factor, which is why I say Pakistan is unique. That said, yes, Pakistan is right now part of the great firmament, great ferment that's going from Morocco to Indonesia, and Pakistan could actually also play a leading role in changing the nature of that ferment by virtue of adopting and accepting a more pluralist vision of Islam as was presented earlier on by tomorrow.
So I hope you guys will join me in thanking Professor